Why would someone want to go to Colombia just to see if they can break up a civil war that's been going on for 50 years? Well, we're going to find out right here on Rainmakers with Rebecca Allen tonight. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Stan.
So you decided to go to Colombia as part of the Christian Peacemaking Team, is that right?
Christian Peacemaker Teams, yes. Yes, and I actually decided to go to Colombia before I decided to join this team, and I think...
Because you didn't want to go down there by yourself and just fight it all by yourself?
I decided it might be interesting to get a little bit deeper look than most tourists are able to, just staying in hostels and meeting other tourists and a few Colombians along the way, and knew that this would be a way to really delve deeper into some of the issues that we don't hear about living here in the United States. And you know, our perspective on Colombia tends to be pretty focused on drugs and maybe the guerrilla movement, yes. And that's about it. So I wanted to find out more.
Well, that's kind of interesting. Usually people would, you know, go to the internet and just kind of do some research. They wouldn't just get on an airplane and go.
Sure, sure. Well, I did live for 2 years in rural Guatemala with a Mayan community just after I graduated from my undergraduate degree and just after I finished that. And so I was working as a human rights community, or excuse me, a human rights accompanier in a small community of about 500 people.
What's a human rights accompanier?
A human rights accompanier is a person who either from the country where violence is happening or an international place, comes to live with people. And the idea isn't so much to do things or to fix problems or to change, but, well, it is in a way to change things, but in the sense of being with people in solidarity. And in some situations where violence is being experienced more directly, that means getting in the way and standing up in a nonviolent way and being active in that. Mm-hmm. And where I lived in Guatemala, it was more of human rights violations in the sense of no access to adequate health care, poor education, no drinking water. This is a little bit less extreme, perhaps.
Guatemala has a reputation of being a pretty dangerous place, though.
It does, especially now. Again, the Civil War ended in '96. But I had friends there tell me, you know, I feel less safe now because of these roving criminal bands, you know, people who have gone to the United States to work, joined gangs, and now returned, can't find jobs, or living in poverty and strike out sometimes in really desperate ways.
So what made you want to go to Colombia?
Well, I knew a few people there, and I wanted to, you know, go back and work on my Spanish, and I think I've also always been intrigued by finding out the story behind the story. And you know, with this facade that we hear in the media, I think about Colombia being a place of drug trafficking mm-hmm. and nothing really more. I knew there had to be a different story going on.
Now, was this a job for you?
No, no. I'm actually in a transition between the work I've been doing for the last couple of years and headed to grad school in the fall. Mm-hmm. So I spent 2 weeks traveling on my own in Colombia and then joined the Christian Peacemaker Teams for the second half of my trip.
Was your work in Guatemala church related as well?
It was through the Brethren Volunteer Service. So it's mm-hmm. sponsored by a church, but in no way missionary related. I wasn't, you know, doing any proselytizing or anything like that.
Okay.
So,
were you doing mission work in Colombia?
I was not. One thing that I really respect about both BVS, who I was with in Guatemala, and also CPT, is that wherever they go in the world, they only go where they are invited by local people who are already doing the work of peacemaking. And those communities know that there's a Christian church affiliation, but they're not expecting people to come in and try to convert them, mm-hmm. And probably would be uninvited if that did end up happening.
So you decided to go.
I did.
And hooked up with this group.
Mm-hmm.
Where'd you go?
Great question. So we met up in Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia. It's at high altitude. I think it's about 8,000 feet. Huge city, 8 million people, mm-hmm.
Very
cosmopolitan in many ways. And spent a few days there meeting with a few nonprofits, and then we spent the bulk of our trip in I was calling it a town, but it turns out it's a city of 300,000 people, about the size of Pittsburgh, called Barranca Bermeja. I know it's a long one. I'll probably refer to it as Barranca from here on.
I'm going to make sure that gets up on the screen.
Perfect, thank you. It's many syllables. And Barranca is the city about 8 hours north of Bogota, so about halfway between Bogota and the Caribbean coast. Mm-hmm. And it's a town right on the banks of the Magdalena River, which is a huge river with lots of traffic coming and going. It's an oil-rich area, so Colombia's largest oil refinery is right there on the banks of the river, and really a boom town in many ways because of that industry.
Well, I got to ask you about that. You say it's oil-rich, so when I hear that, you know, I'm thinking of the Saudi princes and sheikhs who have an awful lot of money, and people in the Middle East who have an awful lot of money.
Sure.
Is the money from the oil in Colombia getting down to the people, which we would say at the bottom of the pyramid?
Yeah, I would say no. That's a fairly simple answer. And what
Why
we
not?
heard, why not? I think that it's a problem in Colombia, but also in many, many other places in the world, of course, that you know, the way those kinds of the corporate laws are set up, it's very easy for multinational corporations, many of them from the US. Canada has a huge mining presence in that same area, and also multinational palm oil companies are there. It's very easy for them to come in and for all that money to flow out again, or some of it, you know, stays with the wealthy elite in Colombia, but very little of it is getting to the people. And part of that is due to the very complex situation of violence that's occurring still in Colombia between the military, the paramilitaries, and the guerrillas.
So what is the situation that you found? Well, first up, though, I got to back up.
Sure, yeah.
You were there primarily working with women.
Yes, well, the focus of our short-term delegation was on women, and specifically women's experience in a conflict area. And that's everything from you know, being directly affected by the military coming to your home and trying to recruit your son for military service, all the way through increased rates of domestic violence happening in your own home with your own loved ones. And meeting women doing all different kinds of work in that whole spectrum of violence, but also of resistance, really, to that kind of scenario.
We have had many people on Rainmakers who have been involved with conflicts in Africa. And in almost all of those conflicts, the men who are on one side or another will go into a home and do very bad things to women to make sure that there is a message that is sent. Does the same thing happen in Colombia?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, unfortunately, one of the organizations we met with in Bogota, more of an advocacy organization, they also do some education, called Casa de la Mujer, so House of the Woman. They talked with us about women that they meet from all over the country who have, you know, regionally very different experiences of that kind of violence. But talked about one woman in particular who in her community, it wasn't uncommon for in the same day or maybe 2 days, the military to come by her house and demand food, drink, and possibly worse, much, much worse. And then later in the day, the paramilitary to pass by and ask for the same thing and make threats because she'd earlier in the day served the military. And then for the guerrilla to come by. I mean, potentially for all three of these armed groups to intimidate her through many different ways, including sexually and other exhibitions of force.
What are they fighting about?
Oh, that is a very complicated thing that I don't think I can hope to unpack here. Simply, I guess the answer would be maybe money and control, power. When the guerrilla movement started in the late 40s in Colombia, this is a very long-term struggle. There was a real ideological focus on, you know, speaking for the people and trying to fight against this ruling elite who had been controlling the nation's resources for a long time. But I think that that ideological focus has really gone by the wayside recently, and you know, paramilitary groups that represent strong right-wing interests and protecting those financial investments in the country, they have their own interests, and so those end up conflicting as everyone wants the resources that are available, and so again and again you see those clashes. It's an extremely complicated conflict that goes back decades, but I think even understanding those three players, you know, the state, the military and the police, the paramilitary and the guerrilla groups, and that from CPT's perspective, because all three of those groups have chosen to use violence as a way of solving problems, all three of them are culpable, and that really no one group of those three will solve the problems in Colombia. It's the people who are resisting nonviolently and taking action nonviolently in their communities who will actually make change.
How can women have a positive impact on this without placing themselves in extreme danger?
That's a great question. Perhaps best answered by a story. So, well, we were in Colombia in mid-July. We were able to participate in the 40th anniversary of a women's organization in Barranca. The women's organization is called the Grassroots Women's Organization, Organización Femenina Popular. Some amazing women run this pretty sprawling network of 1,500 people, and there's a core group of maybe 10 or 15 of them who are actually employed there. And they talked with us about a strategy that they use frequently, which is, you could think of it as going en masse to a place where violence is happening and showing up. And I think, wow, what a powerful story to hear. They talked about a woman who had been beaten by her partner in her home, basically left for dead. In the morning, a neighbor found her and called the Grassroots Women's Organization, and they immediately called several other people in their network, community members, and they all went to that woman's house. They sat with her, they called the police, they called for medical help. The police arrived, and what did they do? Nothing. They didn't know what Colombia's fairly excellent laws tell them they must do in a situation of domestic violence, until the women stood there and they read the law over and over and over and over again to this police officer until he did the right thing.
No doubt.
I believe a man.
Okay.
Yes, but just that idea that, it's not a problem of there not being good laws on the books in Colombia. That's there. It's a matter of enforcing them, and people having so little faith in the system that they are forced to call on each other and to show up that way and to sit there, 20 women sitting there in that woman's house until that police officer agreed to file the correct paperwork and start a judicial process.
Did she recover?
I believe she did, yes, and I think the numbers were maybe 5 out of 150 judicial processes that the OFP, this women's organization, has started in the last 40 years have actually reached completion. So she survived, but I think that also gives you a sense of the challenges that still lay ahead in terms of
Well, actually, what you're describing
justice.
is sounds like more than challenges. It almost sounds hopeless. How is it that so many women are organizing in a place where hope is kind of in short supply?
Yeah. I think in a sense, I wonder if it isn't that very act of organizing that gives people hope and allows them to continue struggling and being with each other and taking big risks for each other in a place that seems so desperate and hopeless, really. And I felt that for me, coming from a very comfortable, middle-class, educated, white existence here in the United States, where it's easy to get lost in hopelessness, I think, when I think about other places that are so entrenched in violence, that it was extremely powerful to see those women stand up together on this stage at their 40th anniversary celebration and sing their hymn of resistance and say, "Wake up, women. If we don't do this, what else is there if we don't continue this fight every day?"
Now, this civil war has been going on now since the late 40s.
Late 40s.
And does it seem to be getting better? Does there seem to be a resolution on the way?
That's a great question. Actually, since I've returned, just a week ago, I believe in the news I saw that the current president, Santos, of Colombia, has agreed to begin peace talks with the FARC, one of the armed guerrilla groups. And so that will be happening in the next several months, I believe, in Oslo. And in many ways, I think many peacemakers
they're going to Norway too?
Yes, to Norway.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think
I get
people,
that.
of course, right? Many people are very encouraged by that. The president in power before Santos, Uribe, very, very popular president, he was adamantly opposed to any kind of peace talks with the guerrilla because he said, if we do that, we give them legitimacy. But the historians and people who stay on top of current events that we spoke with were very clear that they didn't see that a military solution, which is what Uribe proposed, would ever bring a true peace to their country.
So there's the FARCs, who are the guerrillas. There's the
Right.
police, who...
The police and military.
And military together, and
Yes.
then what's the third group?
The paramilitary.
The paramilitary.
Yeah.
Okay, help.
Yes. And actually, a note about the paramilitary in the town and the city where we were in Barranca. It's very regional who is affecting your community. And in that city of Barranca Bermeja, it's the paramilitary that today, in 2012, people feel most threatened by. The FARC are more up in the mountains in a slightly different part of the country. the military and the police maybe are ineffectual in Barranca, as we just talked about, but it's paramilitary who have supposedly been demilitarized who are still threatening them every day as they walk down the street, or maybe in a more subtle way, but still making their presence
All right,
known.
Rebecca, so you're down there as part of a peacekeeping team, or peacemaking team, and having observed the three factions, if you will. Easy question, who's right?
Peacemakers.
Peacemakers, and that's the women. All right, now so here's the big question. For the most part, the people who are in the factions who are fighting, actually shooting, have the weapons, and who are killing, they're men, right?
Yeah, for the most part, I believe that's the case.
So how does a woman, especially the women that you were working with, keep her son from going into one of those factions?
It's very challenging, but that actually points to a huge problem in Colombia, which is displacement. 5 million of the 44 million people who live in Colombia are officially displaced, and many of them have been displaced more than once from their home.
What does that mean?
That means that they've been uprooted for one reason or another from the place that they live. And sometimes those reasons are environmental, flooding or drought or something like that. Sometimes it's that a multinational corporation came in and planted palm on the land that you've always grown corn on and you have to move. But we talked several times with women who had experienced the military or the paramilitary or potentially the guerrilla coming to their house, knocking on the door and asking for their son. And sometimes they may be able to resist that, but more commonly I think people move. And in a way, that is a resistance of a kind. I think it's important to not lose sight of that people are making those very difficult choices as a means of survival.
But if they're part of an organization like the organization with the name that I can't pronounce.
Yes, the OFP we can call it.
The OFP with 1,500 women, and more than 10% of them are forced to move, you lose a good part of your organization.
Well, and that 1,500 women are spread over quite a large region called the Magdalena Medio, the middle Magdalena region, this whole area around the river. So often people are displaced within that region. Sometimes, yes, they're moving out and then you lose numbers, but other people come in. And so it's a very fluid situation.
You talked about some of the women that you met. Tell us about them as people, as individuals, who are, I guess you probably made some friends there.
Yes, we did. I wish, it was 2 weeks actually felt like a very short time. I wish I could have stayed longer and met more people. But one woman who really just sticks in my heart and my mind, Yolanda, is the director of the OFP. And she has actually been forced to move, as we were just talking about. She's been displaced to another city about 2 hours away from Barranca, and she continues her work there as the director of this organization. But she moved because she was receiving death threats and didn't feel it was safe for her and her family to remain in her home.
Who was she receiving death threats from?
That's unknown to some degree. I think people
doesn't
probably
know whether it was the paramilitary, the military,
right,
or the FARC.
Right, and in a sense, maybe it doesn't matter so much because it's still a death threat. So she actually lives in this other city, and she continues to work. And she came to that anniversary celebration. She stood before everyone, potentially at some risk to her life. But the part that struck me so much is that she has bodyguards who travel with her. She travels in an armored vehicle, but she will not allow those bodyguards to carry guns or to be armed in any way, because that women's organization is so committed to the idea of nonviolence that they believe, I'm going against my very principles if I myself am using violence to protect who I am. So there she goes and continues doing her work at some risk to herself.
How do they make a living?
A few, 10 to 15% or 10 to 15 of them are employed. They receive grants from national and international organizations and other donations. A lot of the women we met with, though, I would say work in the unofficial sector, doing things like selling cell phone minutes is actually a huge business in Colombia on the street.
Like a microfinance business that could have been started by Mohammed Yunus in Bangladesh.
Exactly. Some people continue to fish on the river, selling fruit and snacks out of the home, that kind of thing.
So basically it sounds like subsistence existence.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm still looking for, kind of like, where's the future for them?
Sure.
And you said displacement. It may just be the best displacement is just to go to a neighboring country and become a refugee, which, you know, I mean, I'm sitting here very safe in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, right.
So I can say that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's hard for us. I've thought about that a lot. What would it be like for me, you know, even if I were threatened, would I actually leave this place that I live? And yeah, there are, you know, a number of Colombian refugees living in Ecuador and other surrounding areas, but it's no small decision, that's for sure.
So while you were there, or shortly after you left, rather, you heard that the current president is calling for negotiations to take place. And I guess the question then for me is, from your observation, if the negotiations prove fruitful, if the paramilitary said, okay, we won't fight anymore, what happens then?
I think a lot depends on how that process happens and who's involved in that process. Another group that we met with in Bogota, a women's organization called La Ruta Pacifica, which means the peaceful way or the peaceful path. They've been around for over a decade, and they believe very strongly that even though the government has not yet recognized that civilians need to be involved in this peacemaking process, that, you know, people who have never been armed actors need to have a voice in how that peace is created.
How many people is that? Is that a tiny percentage, or is it a lot?
Unarmed civilians?
Yes.
Oh, that is a great question I don't know the answer to. I would guess it's still, you know, a majority of the country because of the number of women and children that exist and how few of them are involved in conflict, but as actors in the conflict. But I can't tell you.
Typically, education is a way out. It's a way out of poverty. It's a way out of hunger. It's a way up in so many different places in what I call impact countries, and Colombia certainly is one of those. Yes. Is there an opportunity for education to be the hope for the mothers in Colombia?
For their children?
Yes, for their children.
Interesting. Yes, I'm sure, in a sense. I guess that our delegation didn't specifically look at educational programs and that kind of thing. What we did see a lot of was maybe more of popular education models, or mothers themselves who are receiving education from different grassroots organizations, and that is extremely powerful too. Casa de la Mujer, talking about seeing women undergo this transformation from always thinking of how they can receive benefits or help for their children, for their partner, even a partner who's abusing them, for anyone else in their family, but never seeing themselves as someone who needs that assistance, or never seeing themselves as a victim. And so both doing the work of helping women see themselves in that light, but then taking the next step beyond that to, I'm not only a victim, but I'm a survivor. And I can, if I don't have the skills I need to work myself out of the situation, then I'll get them.
Describe a day in the life of Rebecca Allen in Colombia as you were working with the Christian Peacemaking Team.
Well, maybe a word quickly about Christian Peacemaker Teams too, and what they do. The way they're set up, they have long-term, you know, people who live in Colombia, in Israel and Palestine, in Iraqi Kurdistan for 2 to 3 years at a time. My group was part of a short-term delegation that was there for 2 weeks, and those short-term delegations happen 3 or 4 times throughout the year in each of those locations where CPT is living. And so our days were very full. I'd say we were usually together with our group 12 or 14 hours a day. We'd meet in the morning for breakfast, and then we'd spend the morning meeting with different grassroots organizations, maybe have lunch, and then in the afternoon we'd go out and walk in some neighborhoods, meet with women who wanted to show us their homes. One morning we traveled on a boat on the river with women who were coming into the big city for the 40th anniversary celebration from all of these smaller towns.
And this was the 40th anniversary celebration
of the Grassroots Women's Organization. Yeah. So it was a very busy schedule. You know, there's so many people to meet with and so little time. So really trying to take advantage of that.
So what did this experience mean for you?
Great question. I'm probably still figuring that out. But something I want to emphasize for all the listeners out there is that I'm not an extraordinary individual when it comes to peacemaking skills. You know, I have a little bit of experience living abroad, but you know, I work with women during childbirth. I don't do this in my regular life, and yet it's people like us, I think, who need to go to places like this and take the risk of exposing ourselves in some way to new knowledge and to potentially a violent situation, though that's really pretty unlikely.
No, no, wait a minute. Pretty unlikely. I mean, one of the women that you were working with had been beaten almost to death.
By her partner, however. And I think, I mean, CPT really wants to make sure that its short-term visitors are safe. And so if there's a community where, well, there is a community that is currently being displaced and experiencing the threats of a palm oil company, people having their crops chopped up by machetes every morning, we didn't go there.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to ask about that. I don't understand. What's the negativity about palm oil?
Ah, yes. Well, palm oil is in so many things. I didn't realize before I left, but it's in cosmetics, it's in a lot of the food we eat, but even a bigger deal is that it's being used for biodiesel. So around the world, really, I think it's being planted right now en masse in places like Indonesia as well, and you know, we're seeing a lot of problems with deforestation. I met a woman in Colombia doing research about jaguars who are being displaced as well, just like the people, from their habitat. And what's happening again and again is that people who have farmed this land for centuries, really, in subsistence, you know, with subsistence crops like corn and yucca and plantains, they're no longer to farm those crops, and they're left working for slave wages, I would call them, for big companies who want their labor but don't really care how these communities are surviving.
Are these big companies that we would know the names of?
Yes, yes, I'm glad you brought that up. While we were driving back from a community, we actually stopped because we saw a sign on the side of the road proclaiming the ownership of this plot of land as property of Unilever, which, again, I hadn't heard of before I left, but other people in my group caught on right away.
Company.
Massive, massive. So I went home and looked up all the brands that I have in my house that use, you know, palm oil from that land. And I think that's good for us to keep in mind that we are involved in some way in the conflict in Colombia because of all the things that we have access to here in this country and the comfortable lives that we live.
We only have about a minute left, and it sounds like you're saying to the people who are watching the show to go and do this for yourself, go and be a part of the peacemaking process.
That would be fabulous. I think the more of us that take that risk, the better, but I think there's also a lot we can do here at home. You know, next time you hear about a speaker talking about Colombia or some other country that you're interested in, go hear it. Stay up on the news, that kind of thing really matters and is so important.
And you gave me a saying that was something that was part of the life down there. It says, if you give me a fish, you fed me for a day, and then you keep on, and we're actually going to put it up on the screen, but it's, if you teach me to fish, then you have fed me until the river is contaminated or the shoreline ceased for development. But if you teach me to organize, then whatever the challenge, I can join together with my peers, and we will fashion our own solution.
Exactly. And I saw that contaminated river with, you know, fish with bones of jelly, and I also saw the people organizing around it, and that gives me great hope.
That'll be the last word. Rebecca Allen from the Christian Peacemaking Teams and the Story in Colombia. We'll see you next time right here on Rainmakers. Take care.